Welcome everyone. Welcome to Biology of Aging. This is Module 1, the definition of aging. We've pretty much broken this course down into 4 modules. And so the first one really explores how we define aging. What does it mean to age? What are the different perspectives and approaches to understanding aging? And how did this field of biogerontology come about, which is really the study or the biology of aging? So we're going to delve into this first PowerPoint in this little mini lecture, and then I'm also going to have you look at the slides and refer to some of the reference articles, and then kind of reflect on the topic before making your contribution to this first week's post. Okay. So our objectives for this session are to define aging based on various parameters. So what are the different approaches we can look at defining aging? We're going to list and classify various theories of aging. We're going to identify and define stages of aging. And then we're going to reflect on some of the disadvantages and advantages, basically the pros and cons that support some of these various theories or these definitions. So what is aging? Aging is a very controversial topic. It's kind of one of those scientific fields or areas where there's a lot of ambiguity. It's a lot of controversy in defining what is aging. Is it a functional definition? Is it a structural definition? Is it chronological? Is there a certain amount of time that has to pass? Or are there certain changes that we have to see physically or cellularly in the body? So there's no one size fits all definition. There have been a lot of different theories and definitions proposed historically, and that's what we're pretty much going to spend this first PowerPoint exploring. We also want to talk about the study of biogerontology. So this is the field that has emerged from all of the controversy around defining aging. This is the field where researchers investigate what are the cellular components of aging, what are the structural changes, what are the various systems that are influenced, which we'll look at in Module 3. And then what are the requirements? Like what is the actual processes are actually involved in aging? So all of that falls under this umbrella of biogerontology. So there are kind of 3 perspectives to look at aging from. We can look at the mortality perspective. This idea is based on the belief that a certain amount of time has to pass and an organism will then become increasingly susceptible to aging processes. They will lose their vigor, they will increase in age, systems will obviously not function the same. And so after this passage of time, we can see that the organism is aging. So based on mortality, how close they get to death, how far away they get to that ideal functioning. And so this theory, we can look at an example of once you're born, you immediately start to age. So this theory aligns with the idea that a baby starts losing its first set of deciduous teeth, and all of that aligns with the aging process. The second theory is based on functionality. So this is a description that has to do with certain time periods. So basically certain functions or certain systems begin to function less. The organism may decrease in its ability to survive. Let's say there's cardiovascular dysfunction, the lungs start to lose their functioning, the kidneys start to lose their functioning. And so the vitality of the organ functionally begins to decrease. So not necessarily amount of time that's passing or amount of time that the organism has been in existence, but actual physical loss of function, physical loss of vitality. This theory or this approach believes that there's a period called senility, which represents the end stage of senescence. And this is when that organism is reaching the end of its lifespan or the end of its life. The third approach is based on cellular level. So this is a much more microscopic approach to aging. And this is the idea that cells no longer function the same as they've worked over and over. So let's say you've got liver cells, heart cells, muscle cells. They begin to accumulate damaged protein. They begin to accumulate damaged DNA. And so over time, the functional effects of those damaged elements is what results in aging. So these are three big umbrellas for how we can approach the definition of aging. We can talk about mortality purely based on chronologic number of days that this organism has been alive. And that is the approach with which we look at loss of vigor or loss of vitality. There's the functional perspective, which is basically looking at the function of systems and how that deteriorates over time. And then there's a more cellular or microscopic approach, which looks at how cells accumulate debris, accumulate damaged proteins and damaged DNA. And so that influences their aging or their functioning over time. So let's look at what biologists define aging as. And biologists have three categories of defining aging. There's primary aging, secondary aging, and tertiary aging. So the primary aging is that the basic set of gains or losses that this organism experiences as a part of the maturation process. So again, thinking about a baby as it begins to lose its primary teeth and it grows in that second set of permanent teeth, that is understood as a part of primary aging. So gains or losses that are a part of just general maturation. We've got secondary aging. This is the result of influences from the environment. So lifestyle choices. You can think about an alcoholic and the effects on the liver of someone who drinks alcohol. You can think of the effects of the lungs, on the lungs of someone who smokes. Or you can think about the effects on the pancreas of someone with diabetes. And so these are the effects of environment, of lifestyle, of diet, and other types of exposure that bring about secondary aging. This is not any type of genetic component, or doesn't have a genetic component here. And then the tertiary category is the rapid decline in the final years before death. So we've got three categories. There's the primary aging, that's a part of just maturing as an organism. Secondary aging, which is the insults or the influences that come from lifestyle, from diet, from environmental exposures, toxins and whatnot. Tertiary category is pretty much that final stage where there's rapid decline in function right before death of the organism. Now, this slide just illustrates some of the biologists and some of their definitions. And what I want to point out on this slide is the difference in the scope or the complexity, where it's going from low to medium or high, and then the difference in actionability. So basically, some of the definitions towards the top are pretty straightforward. So they're going to be low in terms of complexity. And because they're pretty straightforward, the belief here is that an organism loses its function as a natural part of aging, so as a natural part of life. And so there's no actionability with that definition. What this pretty much means is that the aging process is inevitable. There's not a lot of complexity to it. This is pretty much ignoring environmental factors, and therefore the actionability of this approach is going to be very low because it's inevitable. No matter what we do, we are going to age. We can compare this to some of the definitions towards the bottom of this chart. So for example, Attila in 2017 defined aging as aging's underneath the result of multiple, diverse, separate processes, eventually compromising normal functions of the organism at all levels and at different rates. So we can see how this definition is much more complex, takes into account many variables, which would include nature and nurture, that's your genetics and your environmental exposure. And so the scope is going to be high or medium to high. And then there will be actionability here, right? There's going to be interventions that we can introduce to approach this type of aging. So what I really want to point out with this table is that the simpler we think aging is, the more inevitable we think aging is, the less complex we think that aging is, the less we can do to interrupt or to affect the aging process. Whereas when we think of it as a much more complex, multi-system, diverse set of processes that happen at different rates depending on different exposures, then we have a higher opportunity to act, to intervene, or to prevent or delay aging. Okay. So here are some other basic definitions. I'm not going to read through these, but just have a read of these. And I encourage you to pause the slide here and kind of percolate, let them sink in a little bit and think about how they differ from each other. So the definition above is that the random change in structure and function of molecules, cells, and organisms that is caused by the passage of time and by one's interaction with their environment. Aging increases the probability of death. So I want you to think about the three factors that this is based on and think about how they differ from one another. Okay, so now we're going to delve into some of the theories here, and they're basically divided into two major categories. We've got the programmed aging theories. This believes that aging and death are genetically predetermined or pre-programmed in events that happen in an organism. So they're intentional, sort of along the lines of that inevitable nature, and not very susceptible to external influence. And then we've got the random events category of theories, and these theories identify aging as occurring a bunch of random events that can affect an organism that are not predetermined, that are not programmed, that can be accidental, such as diabetes, such as kidney failure, such as cardiovascular injury, that do affect the function of that organism. So again, along those two differing opposing ends of the spectrum, one school of thought is that we can intervene in this process and that it's random and it is sensitive to the environmental influences such as lifestyle. And then the other school of thought is that it's programmed, it is inevitable, it's intentional, and so it's not very sensitive to external influences. So let's go into each of these theories and talk about how they kind of differ. The one thing that the theory must follow, so all of these theories, they differ in their school of thought, so to speak, but they must follow four principles in order to be an appropriate theory of aging. All members of a species must experience it equally. It must result in a physiologic decline in the species. The decline must be irreversible and cannot be undone. And then the process must be gradual and progressive with time. So these are the four requirements that a theory of aging must satisfy in order to be kind of recognized scientifically. And I'm sure we can see why, right? For example, that first principle, if you're telling me that the definition of aging is affecting one race differently than it affects another race, then that is not going to be approved or understood as an adequate theory. It must be experienced equally by all members of any one species. So these are the two schools of thought, the programmed theories on the left and the random events theory on the right. So we're going to go through these one by one. We've got the genetic lifespan theory. This is the idea that our lifespan is determined by our genes. And there is a lot of merit to this theory. We can see this when you look at, we're going to talk about very old individuals, so individuals who've lived beyond the age of 100, and how that lifestyle is, or how that aging trend rather, is usually seen among family members. So there is some sort of genetic component there as well. This idea or this theory also believes that the way we age is written in our DNA. Elephants tend to exhibit this. They die around the same, about 70 years old. We can see other species, spider monkeys typically die at around 25 years old. And then humans usually die at around 80 years of old. Again, we have humans who live way beyond 80 to 100. And even in those groups of humans, we see that travels in genetics, that travels in families. We can look at the telomere theory. This is the idea that telomeres, which are the end caps of our chromosomes, have a certain amount of DNA, but does not necessarily contribute to genes. And so over time, as that cell divides, if you remember the process of dividing, cells dividing, undergoing mitosis, eventually those telomeres begin to shorten as the number of cell divisions go on over the extent of that organism's life. And so the shortening of these telomeres is thought to contribute on a cellular level to this programmed aging theory. The third programmed aging theory is the neuroendocrine theory. Now this theory believes that hormones and the hypothalamus and pituitary axis, so those major master endocrine glands, play a big part in programming or determining when we, how and when we age. So for example, there's loss of function in the main endocrine organs, such as the thyroid and parathyroid. We've got the adrenals, the reproductive organs, such as the ovary and testes. And so as the hypothalamus pituitary axis controls the functioning of these tertiary endocrine glands, that is how we see loss of function in these systems. And we can see how there is some truth or supporting or support for this theory, because when you look at aging, it is very closely associated with reproductive function, especially in females, which we'll see in the second week of this module. So as women get older, they tend to lose their reproductive capability altogether. And males, as they get older, they tend to lose the quality of their reproductive capability. Okay, so let's move over to the second school of thought, which is the random events theory. And the first definition under this group of theories is the wear and tear. So this one is the one that looks most appealing, especially to an anatomist like myself. This is the theory that compares the body to a physical machine. And it simply suggests that after a certain amount of work that this machine has to undergo, it will simply wear out. It's going to exhibit wear and tear. We're going to see loss of function throughout the entirety of the organism, from the heart, the lungs, the basal metabolic rate starts to deteriorate, the brain starts to atrophy. We see the nerves losing their conduction velocity, and this is what gives us that slowed movement as we age. The kidneys lose their ability to concentrate urine. The liver loses function, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see all facets of all systems just simply wearing out over time. And that is the basis for the wear and tear theory. The second random events theory is the cellular clock theory. The individual cells of an organism are programmed with a biological clock and automatically stop replicating after time. So this is the belief that a cell is going to undergo a certain number of divisions and then it will die. And so this is partly acknowledging some of the programmed theory, some of the basis from that school of thought, but the main difference here is that there's a certain number of divisions that this cell will undergo, and that will be influenced by its external environment. A really good example here is what we call the Hayflick limit or the Hayflick phenomenon. And if we take a certain number of cells from a human, we put them into a petri dish, and they will undergo X number of divisions before actually dying, okay? Next, we've got the free radical theory. This is another very tempting one, or very appealing one. There's a lot of support for this theory that we can see in our day-to-day lives. If we think about some of the free radicals that we come into contact with, some of the toxins in our environment, these highly reactive chemicals can actually start to accumulate in our cells and can cause oxidative damage to our cells and specifically to our DNA. So the damage here is going to be progressive and irreversible, and over time it's going to result in a loss of function of those cells. So this is where we get the idea that antioxidants help to prevent aging, slow down aging, because antioxidants are going to help to combat some of the free radical exposure that is thought to be contributing to aging. We've got the rate of living theory, another branch here that really believes that there's a certain fixed number of breaths, heartbeats, or so on that an organism will experience, and then it will die. So again, this is along the lines of this being programmed, but the random component here is that as we're exposed to our environment, that's going to have an influence on the set number of breaths or heartbeats or steps or whatever it is that we can accomplish before dying as an organism. This theory has undergone a lot of scrutiny. As you can tell, probably just listening to it, it doesn't sound like something that we can support with our everyday experiences and everyday lives. There's a lot of variability. There's a lot of external factors. There's a lot of illnesses or just a lot of complexity to the aging process. And it's a little hard to believe from a scientific perspective that we're born with a certain number of breaths or a certain number of heartbeats. And so this theory receives a lot of scrutiny because of its sort of simplistic approach to aging. Then we've got the mitochondrial theory. This is a really important one. This is one of the major theories that is being used or being followed in a lot of the anti-aging science and the anti-aging studies. This is the idea that there are certain damages or injury to DNA that takes place in our mitochondria, and that results in a loss of function of cells. Obviously, this is going to result in decreased function over time. So this is another one of those theories that aligns with antioxidants, preventing some of this damage, preventing some of this loss of function on a cellular level. And then we've got the programmed cell death theory. Again, I think we talked about this one earlier, but this has the understanding that there's a certain or automated amount of function that an organism must experience, and then it will self-destruct on its own. Some of the big proponents or the support for this theory is when we think about the idea of apoptosis. Apoptosis is programmed cell death, and after a cell has been tagged as being dead or dying or senescent or losing its function, it automatically dies. That's what apoptosis is. So because cells can do this, this idea or this theory believes that the entire body has a similar mechanism where after functionality has been exhausted, then the organism will self-destruct. Okay. I'm going to skip over some of these other theories. Feel free to read through them. They're kind of simple in their understanding, but I think we've gone over the major ones, which are the wear and tear theory, the mitochondrial theory, the telomere theory, and so on and so forth. Okay, so just to wrap up here, we can talk about biological aging and we could talk about the disease of old age. It's really important to distinguish that aging should not infer disease or sickness or any type of pathology. What it really infers is a loss or a decrease in function as a result of time and the physiologic mechanisms that take place in our body. Okay. The functional changes and physical deterioration of biological aging are due to a loss in the resistance to entropy brought on by an organism's long-term interaction with its environment. So simply just existing for maybe 70 years, 80 years, and looking at the changes, the functional changes that are brought about over time is what aging really is. Things like developing illnesses or let's say cancer are not necessarily a part of old age, of aging, but are going to be involving some sort of pathology. Okay. So now that we've gone over a general introduction to the various ways that we can look at aging and approach aging, I want you to reflect on the topic and I want you to think about one theory. Pick one that was your favorite or maybe one that you want to scrutinize that was your least favorite. Think about some advantages and disadvantages. These can either be articles that you found, they can be certain facts of anatomy or physiology that may support or not support one of these theories, or they can be experiences that you can draw from in your real life, in your world. Also think about ways that can be supported again, or ways that can be refuted, and then definitely explain why or how. And then give us a brief definition in your words of what you understand aging to be. Alrighty, so I will see you over in the discussion and definitely reach out if you've got any other questions pertaining to this topic.